Take a look at Chapter 4, Children with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, or IDD. So the old definition of individuals with intellectual disabilities or developmental delays was based solely on IQ scores that we talked about in Chapter 6 for learning disabilities. And individuals were categorized in mild, moderate, severe, and profound categories based solely on that IQ score. But the new way that IDD is defined is more comprehensive. It has to originate before the age of 18 and have significant limitations in their conceptual or intellectual functioning using the Wechsler IQ test. And they must have significant limitations in at least 3 adaptive behaviors or skills using the Vineland, such as personal care routines or problem solving or social interactions. Have significant limitations in their everyday social skills. For example, being able to use the theory of mind concept. And this is really about thinking about other people's perspectives on things. And then significant limitations in their routine or practical skills. And so the levels of intensity of the need for support then in this new classification, this is based on the intensity of support a child needs. It takes into account both their cognitive abilities and their adaptive skills. And there are really 4 levels here. There's the intermittent level, and this refers to support as needed, but not necessarily present at all times, just whenever it's needed. Limited refers to support provided on a regular basis, but for a short period of time. And then extensive is support indicates ongoing and regular involvement is necessary. And then the pervasive level of support is constant, high intensity help provided across environments, not only at school but also in the living situation and involving more staff members than the other categories. So the prevalence then of intellectual and developmental delays, the number of children classified as IDD has dropped from about 3% to about 1%. And this kind of has to do with what we were talking about when we talked about the normal distribution, and we said that it's not completely balanced. There are actually less on the lower end of the spectrum than we originally thought. And children once classified as IDD are being defined as having other issues or conditions. Minority children are disproportionately classified as having IDD, and this is probably caused by poverty, or it could be language or cultural differences. And we could offset this by providing more supportive family support services, and we can do this by using the IFSP system in early intervention and increase early intervention more, and then also support in early childhood education programs, infant and toddler programs and preschools. Some genetic mutations that cause intellectual and developmental delays. Down syndrome is the one that's most recognizable by physical characteristics and most well known, and this is caused by an extra copy of chromosome number 21. And a child could have mild to moderate cognitive impairments and then have physiological features that characteristically stand out, as you can see in the photo on the right. And then there's PKU, which we test for after birth with a little prick on the heel. And this is a metabolic deficiency that if it's not caught, it can cause intellectual delays. And with this metabolic deficiency, the liver doesn't produce an important enzyme. And so an individual with PKU just needs a special diet, because if they eat foods that the body can't metabolize, then it can limit, it can cause loss of cognitive ability, because that toxic issue affects brain development. And then the Fragile X syndrome, which is a mutation in the X chromosome. And this can cause cognitive impairments and social and emotional delays. Also, intellectual and developmental delays might be caused by toxic agents in the environment, such as teratogens or teratogens. People pronounce it in different ways. So these adversely affect fetal development, and some examples would be drugs, tobacco, and alcohol. And alcohol causes the second in the list, fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. And this is one of the leading causes of IDD. And some of the symptoms would be hyperactivity, inattention, impaired cognitive function. And actually there are facial characteristics not as extreme as with Down syndrome, but are distinguishable. Being exposed to heavy metals like lead, and this can cause cognitive impairment if they build up to high levels in the body. For example, if a family lives in an older apartment building that's been around for a long time, and paint's peeling off the walls, sometimes the paint, the oldest paint in that chip may have lead in it, and that can cause cognitive impairments if children eat it. And then illness like rubella during pregnancy can harm the developing fetus, and that's why we want to make sure that women have their measles vaccination before they get pregnant, so that if they don't get measles while they're pregnant. And then high fevers, the child actually getting high fever themselves can result in damage to cognitive abilities. There could also be environment and experiences that can result in intellectual and developmental delays. For example, research focused on the brain determined that environment and experience matter. Environments need to be stimulating to produce more dendrites in the brain, so that the brain can function and be wired and connected with each other. The neurons in the brain, the more connections, the better. And this can mitigate certain conditions. For example, in the past, Down syndrome individuals would be put into rest homes or institutions rather than raised at home. And what we found is with Down syndrome individuals, or individuals with Down syndrome end up at home, the outcomes are much more positive, and so that mitigates the effects of Down syndrome. The earlier and more intense environmental factors are, the greater the impact they will have on outcomes for individuals with IDD. So early, positive, and intense interventions can have a greater impact on outcomes. And then the right environment and experiences can improve both cognitive abilities and adaptive behaviors. And with IFSPs and early interventions, parents and educators have an important role to play in outcomes for children. And so here's our information processing, or IPM model again. And so in this context, then, if we look for the primary effects, we can see, of course, executive function is there. And then we move over when we look for primary or even associated to thinking, memory, classification, association, reasoning, and evaluation. And that is going to affect speaking and writing, and then associated with motor responses and social interactions for intellectual and developmentally delayed. So the RTI approach is for students with IDD at the university tier 1 level, and remember this is the most common placement, and at the bottom level, excuse me. And so here services would be provided with inclusion, incorporating students with special needs into the general education classroom environment. Adaptations would be made to the general classroom curriculum or environments. And then a collaborative professional team approach helps the general classroom teacher to be successful in meeting the needs of all the students in the inclusive classroom. For example, having instructional aides, having support from a special ed teacher. And then the second level, tier 2, this is the targeted tier where students are pulled from the regular classroom for short periods of time for special intensive targeted instruction in a resource environment in a variety of academic and adaptive skill areas like occupational therapy, where they learn how to tie their shoes or to do grooming tasks. For example, and students with IDD typically need more time and more direct instruction to make gains in academics and in adaptive skills than do their typically developing peers. And something to keep in mind is that these adaptive skills are not generalized, so they need to also be directly connected to certain activities and presented for all these activities because they don't, for example, going to the grocery store and paying for something can't be generalized to going to a restaurant or to a department store, and so it needs to be presented in all those different environments in order for it to be truly incorporated in their adaptive skills. And then the intensive tier level at the top, where there would be less individuals at this level, and this would provide more intensive interventions in a separate environment like a self-contained special ed classroom, focusing on skills different from those in general education classrooms. And the current approach is to focus on a student's skills to develop more effective interventions, like we talked about in the individualized education program. And some students may be unable to master the general education curriculum, particularly in middle school or high school, but can still learn and build skills that will help them transition to adulthood. So they may be able to hold down particular types of jobs. And so some different techniques that might be used is differentiation, and this is the practice of adjusting the level of difficulty of a task to challenge all students appropriately depending on their strengths. And then teachers consider the strengths of all students in determining the type of task that is appropriate for each, and assignments should still allow all students to participate in the class in meaningful ways. Communication and social skills. Communication skills focus on learning to listen, discuss, and share experiences. And these kinds of skills require direct instruction or steps that are practiced and directly discussed in order to develop these skills. And then social skills like taking turns, sharing, and working cooperatively can also be taught through daily classroom activities like role-playing or pretending to carry out a particular task like sharing. And then peer or buddy systems and peer support networks and circles of friends that support each other. Instructional strategies, positive behavioral interventions and supports. This focuses on what might be causing disruptive behaviors, so observing students to see what might be causing the behaviors that are disruptive, and then changing the environment so that those motivations aren't there anymore, and this will prevent the negative behavior. So for example, when I was working with special ed children through a behavioral medicine clinic environment, there was a child who had autism that was disruptive. At a particular time of day, he would take off all of his clothes and run around the classroom. And through observation and documentation, we discovered that it happened as a result of lunchtime. And the child did this one time and got to go home instead of having to go to lunch. And lunch was really stressful for him because it was the classroom ate lunch in the cafeteria, and he was sound sensitive, and that was really difficult for him. And so adjustments were made so that the student could eat lunch in the regular classroom with several of the other children. That was the least restrictive environment for them too, and then that disruptive behavior disappeared. Scaffolding is an instructional strategy that includes modeling and then gradually step-down support to facilitate independence with a task. And so let's take a look at the theory behind the scaffold instructional approach. So this is directly related to Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. And he talks about a zone of proximal development is involved with scaffolding. And he says in order to scaffold children's learning, you need to observe and determine the level of their functioning currently, and then be well versed enough to know what would come next, and not a huge leap next, but a baby step. And in between those two levels, the lower and upper level, is the zone of proximal development, and that's where an adult or another child could scaffold or facilitate and support that child's development to the upper level. And so an example of this would be when a child is learning to walk. Once they pull themselves up on the furniture, the next step is not walking. The next step is holding onto the furniture and then cruising around the furniture or moving around the furniture, standing up with their hands on the furniture to develop their muscle strength. And then they'll let go of the furniture and stand for a while, and then they'll take their first steps. So when I'm talking about baby steps, the first thing is pulling themselves up on the furniture, and how we can scaffold is to move the furniture closer together so that the child can walk around not just one piece of furniture, but lots of different pieces of furniture, and that can scaffold them to being able to one day letting go and standing without holding on. Some more instructional strategies would be reciprocal teaching. So the teacher models how to instruct, and then students actually become the teachers, and they take an active role in teaching material. And then cooperative learning, which would be group instruction and peer interactions in the learning process. And then thinking about motivation and self-determination. Past failure and learned helplessness can affect motivation. And learned helplessness is a condition that results from failing in the past and then really giving up because they failed so often, and that means they're not motivated anymore. And so what we want to do is make sure that we set up learning experiences and situations where a child will feel successful and will become confident in their abilities. Self-determination is the ability to set personal goals, to take appropriate action to achieve these goals, to make choices and problem solving, improve self-determination, abilities of students to self-manage, and this will enhance their self-confidence, higher motivation, and improve their adaptive skills. And so to determine the effectiveness of interventions, we want to make sure that we're providing interventions that are of significant duration, or they happen over the necessary amount of time, and make sure that they are at the appropriate level. In other words, we can't assume just because it happens a child accomplishes a task once or twice that they've completely accomplished the task, but we want to make sure that that's stable. Students often lose in gains made during an intervention if the special treatment is stopped too soon. Research suggests that many students are not receiving adequate support through their IEPs because the IEPs are created with a template rather than being individualized. So then transitioning to work and community, the ultimate goal of transition is to achieve as much independence as possible. And so this will require systematic planning over several years, careful attention to the development of essential skills that will be needed to go to work or to function in the community, and then ongoing support in adulthood. And research suggests lower rates of employment and independent living for individuals in this category than with other disabilities.